microphone because we are recording these. Since it's been 3 weeks, I will just remind you, I'm Jim Reed, and I have the honor of being your facilitator. So we're starting our second meeting tonight. I thought I would just do a quick review of the agenda, but maybe we should go around and do introductions again because you do have a new task force member. So, Lynn, maybe you should go first since you're the new person here.
Now is it on? There we go.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Lynn Swagstra. I've been a Kenmore resident since 2016. We're relatively new to the state of Washington. I am a frequent parks and trails user. My dog has seen just about every trail and park in Kenmore, I think. And professionally, I'm the Parks and Community Services Director for the City of Kirkland. So I do a lot of budget and finance and policy and whatnot. So happy to be here and learn more about Kenmore and see how I can be of assistance.
Welcome.
I'm Elizabeth Spring. I am a 12-year resident of Kenmore, and I am one of the owners at Seaplane Kitchen just across the street. I have 2 kids, and they go to Kenmore Elementary, so we are here for the long haul.
Jeff Pooley. My wife and I just bought a house in Kenmore, just a couple of blocks up the street from Seaplane, actually. That was 8 months ago. We've got 2 daughters. I work in the Bothell Business Park. I ride my bike on the Burke-Gilman Trail to get there, so really appreciate the work that the city has done to make the roads and trails accessible, and we're also planning on staying here long term, so excited to be a part of this.
Anthony Tarnowski, Kenmore resident for 3 years. My wife and I and our daughter, who's 18 months, live here. I work for Amazon. I work downtown. I am a everyday park and ride user. So yeah, we love Kenmore, and I thought this would be a fun way to get involved.
Let me just walk you through the agenda real quickly. I hope it is clear enough that I don't have to really go into all the different details. But tonight, we covered a lot of ground 3 weeks ago, and tonight we're going to even cover more. Rob and Joanne are going to still kind of give you all the background and context that we think you need. So starting even with looking at services by departments and their expenditures and revenues, and then give you a chance to ask questions about that. And then Joanne's going to cover the things you see here on the agenda, from operating capital down to kind of previous financial sustainability actions. We also have a public engagement proposal. It came in 2 parts. We really want your comments on that and talk a little bit about how you might be involved in that. So we'll go through the schedule showing our remaining task force meetings as well as the public engagement events, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So that is it for this evening. We don't have anybody here who have signed up to speak, so I guess we're not going to have any testimony tonight. Okay. Thanks. Okay. I guess I should also just do one thing. I wanted to make sure that you got from me the summary of our last meeting, and does anybody have any comments about it? Did you think there was anything mistaken or missing, or just to get you to comment on that? Okay. So I think with that, I'll turn it over to Rob.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks for volunteering for this committee. I know this is a lot of time for you to carve out, and I really appreciate it, and it's hopefully going to serve the greater interests of the 23 residents and plus all the businesses that serve and work here, so thank you very much. And thanks, Lynn, for being willing to serve and fill in for the vacancy left by David Lane. And you saw the email chain when he decided to leave the committee. Any questions or concerns about that? Okay. All right. And Darlene, I might go email or text her or something to see where she is, because Darlene Ademba is our 7th committee member, so I'm hoping she'll be able to come. Yeah, do you mind shooting her an email? Yeah, so we're still in the phase of this committee where we're doing a lot of talking, and I apologize in advance for that, but what we're trying to do is just arm you with as much information as you can in helping us make a recommendation. So these first few meetings may sound like we're just doing all the talking, but hopefully that'll change as we get more into discussions in the future meetings. So, all right. So I have a bunch of things to talk about. One is I'm going to talk a little bit about our city government and how we work. I'm going to use that electronic whiteboard.
Council manager. Redmond.
Police, fire.
Transportation planning? Transportation planning? Put that in roads, okay. Parks.
Where does, like, taxes fall, like collecting property tax on behalf of the state? Is that something we must do? Yeah, it's gotta go on, like, both sides.
Would it, would affordable housing fall under the must, or would that be an optional?
Very interesting.
We're required to provide municipal court services for infractions and misdemeanors. All things we write checks for. Kirkland is kind of the opposite. Kirkland provides most.
Oh, so we're the neighbor here. Water, yeah. Oh, yeah, and sewer, sorry, yeah.
I'll make sure in my notes to put that at the top of the list.
I hope they're not watching.
Can I turn it down?
And you have things in the budget that we. Oh, thanks. All right. So, the city council, the legislative branch, they really, they're responsible for the purse strings of the city. The job for managing the city's finances and making sure everything balances ultimately rests on them. Plus, they come up with all the policies and goals and priorities for the city. So they write my playbook every year, and what's important to them is important to me. And every year they set goals for the city. They have a retreat every January, and they set top goals, and we'll hand those out a little bit later. But yeah, their job mainly is to legislate and to govern. So they meet 2 or 3 times a month. So next slide. Yeah, thanks. And Joanne mentioned the council does get paid. It's not a living wage by any stretch, and I think it might not even be minimum wage, depending on how many hours they put in each month. All right, this is the city clerk. So the city clerk is what I call the steward of democracy. I wish that was her real title, steward of democracy, but she's supposed to make sure that the meetings get noticed and that we follow state law when it comes to open public meetings and the minutes and the postings and all that happen. Our city clerk has a lot of other jobs as well, including she manages the human services contracts for our city, does a lot of contract management and records management and other things.
You can see in this budget is where we account for our human services contributions. And in this biennium, we've appropriated $172,000 for 2019 and $174,000 for 2020. That's why the impact is here in the clerk's budget, and you'll see the increase over the prior biennium because it used to be accounted for in a different department.
Okay. City manager's budget. So, so we have obviously the city manager there. We have the assistant city manager, and she's in charge of economic development. That's Nancy Owsley. She also represents the city on different boards and commissions, including ARCH, that affordable housing group. She runs the incubator and other economic development programs. We also have the volunteer and events coordinator here in the city manager's office. That person runs all of our events and concerts and things and gets the sponsorships and that sort of thing. New to this year's budget is a halftime recreation coordinator. I mentioned that position a minute ago. The city council asked for that position to be added, and again, it's halftime, and we only have it for a 2-year limited term. The purpose of the recreation coordinator is to be more of a one-stop shop for all the recreation activities that happen in the city. And like I said, our model is not to provide direct recreation services, but it's to leverage the resources of other entities. And so before she came, we used to have it spread out all among city staff, all the different recreation contracts. But now it's all managed by one person. And she's actually going out and getting additional groups to come in and provide rec services, like at the hangar and other places. Examples of what she does, the Kenmore Waterfront Activity Center, they provide hand-powered watercraft programming down at Squires Landing Park. She's the city's go-between, so we allow that entity to use our storage facilities and dock space in return for providing public programming, and Rita manages that contract. Another one is like the kayak concession at Log Boom Park. We have a for-profit company that does kayak rentals at Log Boom Park, and she manages that contract. And the Skyhawks contract, the agreement with the nonprofit senior center, and a host of other recreation providers. Also in the city manager's office is we have a records officer, and she almost full-time, probably a good 60% of her anyway, does responses to public records requests. That's really increased over the last decade. There's a lot more public records requests coming in, and all cities are noticing that. And it's a good 60 to 70% of her time is responding to public records requests. She also provides admin support to the assistant city manager and other departments. And then we have a communication specialist, the person who sends out all the email and newsletter and social media and all those things. So, all right. Yeah. Yeah. So the reason it's dropped off is we've just shifted it to other departments. We've shifted some intergovernmental over to the city council's budget and also to Joanne's budget. But intergovernmental is money we have to pay to other government agencies like Puget Sound Clean Air Agency. We're required by state law to cut them a check for our share of their air quality enforcement activities. That's one example of intergovernmental, but we provide other intergovernmental contracts as well.
Probably the biggest shift just in this biennium was the move of the human services contributions into the clerk's cost center, because she administers those contracts now.
This is Joanne's budget.
Are you waiting for me to talk about it? Okay.
Sure.
Okay. The finance and administration budget has 3 folks in this department: myself, an accountant, and then a payroll and accounting specialist. And the functions of this department are to do all the budgeting, financial reporting, pay the bills, do the payroll, account for debt management and earnings on investments. We invest all the cash. I'm also in charge of human resources and administration of employee benefits. We process claims and incidents, do risk management, maintain the city's insurance, property and liability, and oversee the citywide network and computers.
So that's a lot for 3 people. So finance, which is accounts payable, receivable, budgeting, financial reporting, all that. So finance, IT, HR, risk management, all under Joanne. So pretty lean operation. It, quite frankly, worries me sometimes because HR in particular is rapidly changing all the time. State law is changing about employee benefits and leaves and things like that, and we're constantly having to pivot and change and respond to state law on that, and then case law is changing all the time. And that's Joanne's part-time job, in addition to being finance director and IT and risk management. So that weighs on me, having her do all that. Okay.
What's in the supply, the services line?
Well, there's a lot in that services line. The big thing is all the insurances are paid for out of this department. That's the one big item in there.
Like buildings and.
Yeah, property and
Liability.
liability being the biggest piece. Liability is based on not just claims but work or hours, so that is between 150 to 200 a year.
Rob, can I interrupt for just a second?
Yeah.
We do have to get everybody's voices more recorded here, so Jeff,
Sorry.
everybody, if you'll just like kind of lean forward when you ask your question, so, yeah, you don't have to repeat it, but I want to make sure we've got everybody.
Give you guys an extra mic here.
I'd also like to say, because that's a good question, in our budget document, we don't show a line item detail, but if there's ever a desire on your part to see the line item detail, we can surely provide that.
Yeah.
I just don't remember how all the accounts roll up onto each line item tonight, but certainly happy to provide it.
Mostly just interested in the big movers, but yeah,
Sure.
thank you.
Okay, legal services. So this is another area where we contract for service rather than having it in-house. We contract with a firm called Inslee Best, and our city attorney is a partner in that firm. Dawn Rayton is her name. And in addition to what we pay Inslee Best, we also have some specialty service attorneys from time to time. For example, we'll occasionally need to bring in an attorney that's an expert in environmental law that maybe Inslee Best doesn't have the expertise for, things like that. We just did a request for proposals for legal services and decided to stay with Inslee Best. Rod Casaguma was our attorney, and he retired, and now Dawn Rayton just recently got appointed. But we have to talk to her a lot. We have to call her a lot and invite her to meetings. She attends most of our city council meetings. So at any given time, we have a small handful of lawsuits or about to be lawsuits. So all right.
One thing I'd like to add is that we've often talked about, should we bring this service in-house or should we continue to contract for it? This has worked for us, in my opinion, in that when you have a firm, you have specialists within that firm who can address their particular topics. For instance, I use the employment lawyer a lot. Development Services uses the land use lawyer a lot. You can't always get that wide range of expertise with one person, but there are advantages and disadvantages to both. But.
Yep. I found that even if you have an in-house attorney, you still have to contract with a firm for a bunch of things because one attorney can't be an expert in everything.
Mm-hmm. And this is a budget that can really hit you hard too if you get into some significant litigation and drive those attorney costs up, which we've seen in prior years. The last few years we've been pretty stable, but we've had a couple of bad years where we've incurred a lot of legal expenses.
Do you contemplate that kind of risk in it? Because we talked about just the general, you want to have this much in the bank, this many percent of your operating expense or whatever. Is that just kind of part of that general metric, or do you contemplate other kind of legal or risks like that could potentially throw something off in the budget?
I would say we don't budget for the unexpected, but we have reserves that we can go to
Okay.
if need be for something like that.
Yeah, our insurance carrier would hopefully cover most settlements from lawsuits, but there are exclusions. There are things that our insurance carrier won't cover us on. So we do have to be ready for that. But
Right. We haven't talked much about insurance, but we do belong to a statewide risk pool. And most claims, personnel claims, some land use claims, are generally covered by that, and they're very well funded, but there are some exclusions that could come up that would hit us.
And that covers both the liability and the attorney expenses associated with something like that?
Often, yes, because they do have their own attorneys that they will put on a case for us.
Got it.
Who would work with the city attorney, but they might be specialist in a certain area.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. And sometimes the insurance company will take it over for us and just deal with it. And sometimes much to our chagrin. So, like one time we had, this was like in 2012 or something, but we had a guy who's claimed that we had a broken stormwater pipe that was leaking and caused his house to settle downhill. And he sued the city, and our insurance company took it over, and their attorneys went to work. And we were able to demonstrate that that pipe was not even remotely to blame, and that there wasn't even a pipe there. It was deactivated years ago. And but the insurance company said, you know what? He's going to fight it, and rather than take it all the way to court, we're just going to write him a check for $90,000 for him to go away and promise not to sue us again. And that was the insurance company's call, and the council was mad, but the insurance company did a cost-benefit analysis, and they said, well, we could fight it in court or just write him a check now, and they decided to write him a check. But that increased our rates later, right? Any claims we get?
A little bit, yeah.
Little bit,
They're kind of smoothed out, but yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. And that
Okay.
story is not over, by the way. But, all right, what's next?
Well, what's next is the non-department department.
Only in government.
Yeah, we've tried to whittle this one down. It used to have expenses that nobody wanted in their department. So we put them in non-department, and they were shared, but I don't follow that methodology. So the only thing we account for in here is if the general fund is going to transfer money to another fund, like the street fund, we'll account for it in this non-department group. It's just not associated with council or finance or legal. And also on the receiving end, if a fund is going to reimburse the general fund for something or transfer money in, we just run it through this non-department group of accounts. That's really all it is.
Yeah, so you see transfers from SWIM, Surface Water Management Fund. So what that is like I spend some of my time on surface water, Joanne does, and kind of administrative overhead. And by the way to recognize that is the Surface Water Management Fund sends the general fund money to help pay for a portion of my time, a portion of Joanne's time.
What's really interesting about governmental accounting is the fund accounting part of it. It's not like corporate or private industry accounting. So there's buckets or funds of money for many different purposes. So it causes there to be a lot of inter-fund transactions going on. Money comes into a restricted fund over here, it's needed over here, so you have to transfer it in. The general fund collects certain revenues that we have said we're going to use that on street maintenance, so we transfer it over to the street department. So all of that inter-fund accounting takes place here in this non-department group of accounts. So we take some of our revenues, our franchise fees from water and sewer, and move those into the street fund every year for street maintenance.
Yeah, from general fund to street fund.
And as Rob said, the surface water fund reimburses the general fund for the administrative overhead. We also collect the direct costs of park project managers and transportation project managers for their time, for their fully loaded salary costs that they can charge to their capital project, and then that reimburses our salary budgets in the general fund.
Yeah. And Joanne mentioned that we have a bunch of different distinct funds. But the really the only one that's not restricted is the general fund. So the general fund can feed other funds, but not necessarily the reverse is true. The reverse is not true. Like surface water utility can only be, revenue from surface water utilities can only be paid for, can only pay for surface water utility related things. Surface water can't feed the general fund unless there's a legitimate reason, like I'm spending my time on surface water, things like that. And another example of a restricted fund is real estate excise tax fund. So state law, so whenever you sell your house, you pay real estate excise tax, and most of it goes to the state, but the city gets 0.5%, and we can't put that into the general fund. State law says that you can only spend real estate excise tax on capital, building new things, with a minor exception. But so because of that, we put real estate excise tax into its own restricted fund. Same with impact fees. So when new construction happens, we charge impact fees to help pay for the growth impacts of new construction. Those go into their own restricted impact fee funds, and they can only pay for capital for new growth. So they don't help the general fund at all. All right, back to public safety. This is the biggie. Look at that big number. So 4.6 million in 2020. Most of that is police contract. The police contract is approaching 4.5, 5 million, something like that. Mm-hmm. And like I said, we contract with King County for that service. And always one way to demonstrate the budget problem that we have is that contract increases by about 3 to 5% every year, and the salaries and wages are negotiated by the county and passed on to us. And I have to, just to keep the police contract the same, no change, status quo the same, we have to find anywhere between $150,000 and $200,000 of new money every year just to keep police the same. So, and in addition is jail and court and prosecutor and public defender. In that, we also have see where it says SRO reimbursements. That's school resource officer. So we pay for police officers to go and hang out at the schools during school hours, and the school district helps pay for that, and so we pay for a share of it. The school district pays for a share, and so that's where you can see the revenues. That's what the school district pays us for the school resource officer.
The amounts for jail fall under Row 12, right? Intergovernmental. That's all the.
Yep.
The human outlay and infrastructure for that.
Yeah, and we have two main options for jail. I'd like there to be a third. I've been talking to your boss about us using your jail, but I know he's not ready for us yet. Oh, good. But there's the King County Jail right there in downtown Seattle, but they're really expensive. SCORE, South County something, regional, South Correctional. Anyway, it's a group of South King County cities that got together. It's in Des Moines, and they built a jail, and they built more capacity than they needed. So other cities send their inmates down to SCORE. It's a long drive, but it's still cheaper than sending them to the King County Jail. But it does take our cops off the street, because when they arrest and book somebody, they have to drive all the way to Des Moines to take the person down there. We used to, our favorite option was Snohomish County Jail in Everett, but they had some issues and they kicked everybody out. They kicked all the contract agencies out and said, we got to get our own house in order before we start accepting inmates from other cities. And so they haven't allowed us to join them. But we're not alone. So like Shoreline also uses SCORE. So it's,
We're always looking for a good opportunity. We've used Yakima for long-term
Yeah.
incarcerations in the past, and so whatever makes the best economic sense. But then we went to Snohomish County, and that was a really favorable arrangement while it lasted.
remember, we're responsible for jailing misdemeanants, and definition of a misdemeanant is up to $5,000 fine or up to 1 year in jail. So once they hit the 1 year mark in jail, they become a felon. So we have the potentially to pay for 364 days of somebody being in jail. And we have those daily bed rates and everything. If you want to see them, we're happy to get you those. It's not cheap. And then every once in a while, they'll call us and say, hey, this person has a major medical issue, and we SCORE are not going to pay that medical bill. What do you want to do? And do you want to have a police officer stand guard over this person while they're in the hospital that you, the city, have to pay? So we have to deal with those things, those types of things every once in a while. So, all right.
So we see the cost, but it sounds like there's been some ups and downs depending on who we're contracting. Is there an overall trend in the use of the number of people jailed and how many days they're jailed? And
Yeah, right now it's trending around 450,000 a year for jail.
But I guess what I'm asking is the number of prisoner days per year, has that been pretty steady over the years, and the change and the most of the financial change has just been in changing contracts, or has that the actual occupancy rate gone down or up, or?
It's gone down. We used to pay about 600,000 a year for jail, and it's gone down to about 400. That's a dramatic drop, and a welcome drop.
And that drop has been because fewer people are going to jail for shorter periods of time.
Yeah.
Okay.
And, you know, there's a difference in police chief can cause your jail bill to go up or down. And when we got a new chief police, and our jail bill went down. We were arresting less people. So,
Depends a little bit, too, on the judge,
yep.
you know.
And
Their
even the
philosophy
prosecutor.
of-
Yeah.
And the prosecutor, that whole team can really have an influence on your jail budget.
Yeah, we just got a new, so we have 2 district court judges that serve our area, Shoreline and Kenmore, and we just got a new one, Judge Campagna, and don't know how tough he is on crime yet, but we'll see. So. All right.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's a big driver, and I'd love to see, maybe we could double click into some of that, how much is Kenmore spending annually on like nonviolent misdemeanor jail time that we don't even really service, right? We're paying.
What was your last part, that we what?
Right, we're paying someone else to, take care of that, like this jail and SCORE. But it
Okay.
also doesn't sound like something we control, right? It's up to the police commissioner, it's up to the judge. So as we start to like break down, start thinking about solutions, like that's a big number. But I would love to know like how controllable you guys feel like that number is, right? Is it how many people are getting arrested? Is it the type of contracts we have, or is it a decision that the city can make on the types of crimes it sends people to jail for?
Yeah.
Maybe along the same lines, when we look at some of the larger contract out of city contracts, is there some kind of a rule of thumb or tipping point at which you would say, well, if you have this volume of prison days, then it makes sense to have your own facility. It may need, you go talk to a couple other cities to make that happen, but it would be cheaper to do that. Or in the case of public safety, is there an FTE tipping point, at which point you would bring that in-house? Or is there a way to look at this? Or are we so below that tipping point that wouldn't really become a decision? But if we were getting close to that tipping point on our own, or we would look at some of the other cities who are looking at the same problem and say, if we did this together,
Yeah.
we would be able to be above that tipping point. It would make sense for us to have some kind of a joint facility. Do we have a sense of,
Yeah.
some of you guys look at that
Yeah.
sort of stuff?
I know there was an effort just before I came to Kenmore for a North End regional facility. I think we were in it with Shoreline and Bellevue and some others. And they couldn't come to an agreement on a site.
Yeah. That's
So.
a common problem.
Yeah.
But I think more about,
But
Everything
it's
we're
probably
doing-
coming up again,
yeah.
you know.
I think given the population trend and all the work we're doing to increase infill and density of population, this is going to be we maybe reached that tipping point earlier than what we may have anticipated a few years ago.
Yeah, and there's also more and more of a philosophy to not incarcerate people and to send them to treatment and other alternatives. So,
Is there, expanding on that, has there been any effort to direct some of the humanitarian funds or to programs or things like that would shift any of that, or?
I can't think of any that along those lines. That's an interesting question, though.
You know, something like I was just talking to Lynn about homeless outreach, or, you know, instead of the cops going around and gathering people up and putting them in jail, you know, getting outreach services that get them connected to shelters.
Oh,
or
yeah.
those kinds of things.
Yeah, thanks for that. There's actually a new program that King County Council member Rod Dombowski got funded for the North End. It's called the Navigator Program, and they used some King County grant money to fund a mental health professional to ride along with police officers, and that's been going on for almost a couple years now, and I don't have like any empirical data on it, but the police officer is saying that it's a game changer. It's the mental health specialist is able to intervene where a police officer can't and help the person navigate through the treatment process and kind of talk them down off the ledge and all those sorts of things. So there's an example where we have a mental health specialist riding along with police officers to help avoid sending them to jail and avoiding arrests and things like that. But there probably could be more of that.
Well, also within, you know, the criminal justice framework, there's a mental health court that sometimes folks are
Yeah.
directed to help facilitate that special need for services. And also, King County Court is bringing community courts into the specific city localities. So I'm not sure, but I think Shoreline might be opening a community court. I know they've talked to us about a community court. So those efforts hopefully will help in the larger. I'm not an expert on criminal justice, but
Yeah.
what I'm trying to say is they're trying to put more resources into redirecting people away from just incarceration.
Yeah, good question.
And then one more question, kind of to Austin's point, I think, about how much of those costs are controllable. I'm also thinking, you know, Kenmore is a relatively safe neighborhood,
It is, yeah.
community, and so I would be curious to know kind of the activity level of the police officers. You know, what's the patrols? You know, those kinds of things. And how does that rank? Like, how much activity is there compared to how much actual criminal activity is there, and how does that compare to other cities?
Yeah.
You know, because if we can rely on the general safety, or, you know, I don't know how you guys have probably thought about this, but I would imagine that there's a level of, we can assume our community is generally safe, and we only need this level of patrols or those kinds of things, and just looking at what levers there are and where we are in relation to things. So
Yeah, those are really great questions, and those are things that are really good to look at. So when it comes to figuring out how big should your police force be, a lot of people like to use the statistic of officers per 1,000 population, But I don't believe in that statistic because cities are so different. Some cities have a lot more commercial activity and some are more residential, and there's different crime rates and all those things. And so it's better statistics are crime rates per officer, violent crimes, calls per officer, and types of calls per officer, things like that. And you're right, we are a safer city than a lot of cities in the area. Our crime stats are pretty low. One other thing on police is, so we contract with King County, and back in 2011, we hired a firm to look at our contracting relationship with King County and actually compare it to an in-house scenario if we had our own police force and that. The study concluded that we're saving about $1 million a year by contracting with King County, mainly because we're taking advantage of their economy of scale. So we only have 14 police officers for a city of 23,000 people. That's not very many police officers. Why can we get away with that low of police officers? Because we take advantage of the command structure of King County Sheriff. And so, for example, the boss, so our chief of police is a sergeant, rank of sergeant in the King County Sheriff's Office, and he reports to the chief of police of Shoreline. And the chief of police of Shoreline is in the sheriff's department, and by sharing administration and all that, we're able to save on costs. For example, our chief of police does not have an administrative assistant like a lot of police chiefs do. Why? Because all that administration is provided up at the City of Shoreline Police Station, and we just tap into that and share that with Shoreline. By the way, the study also said that if Lake Forest Park got rid of its police department and went with the county, they would also save money too, and told Lake Forest Park that. But another thing on police officers is we have what we call minimum staffing 24/7. So at any given time, we have at least 2 officers on duty all the time, and often more than 2. But it takes about 6 or 7 officers to provide one 24/7 shift. Why is that? Because you've got vacation time and leave time and sick time and all that, and you've got to be around the clock. So it takes about 6 or 7 officers to provide one officer around the clock. So that's why we have 14 police officers, is to provide that 2 officer minimum staffing at all times. Our chief of police likes to, when it's more than 2, he likes to schedule that during our busier times, like on weekends and things like that. So, all right. We're taking a long time, I apologize, but these are great questions, and it's important for you guys to get into this. So, are we on to engineering?
Engineering. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Engineering's, they have several main jobs, but mainly think of them about working in our, doing work related to our right-of-way. So our streets and our sidewalks and our shoulders, anything that's in the city's right-of-way. Probably the biggest time consumer for them is capital projects. So like the bridge replacement and walkways and waterways projects and things like that. In addition, they also provide right-of-way permits. So when contractors and utility companies cut into our road and put in a pipe or put in a utility line or something like that, or do a driveway, they have to come and get permission from us to do that. And then we have to make sure that they're doing it correctly and that they're providing good safety control and things like that. And we go out and inspect what they do so that they put our road back together in a good. So that takes a lot of time. We actually have one full-time right-of-way inspector. He's mostly charged to the street fund and paid for largely from the permit fees for cutting into the right-of-way. Oh, Also, we have a traffic engineer. And that's a new position that the city added a few years ago. I think in 2015, we added a brand-new it's not very common for a city our size to have a full-time traffic engineer. Like Kirkland is 4 times our size, and I think you guys only have 1 traffic. Oh, you have 3 traffic engineers?
Oh, no, sorry. No, yeah, you're right.
I think you have 1 traffic engineer.
Traffic engineer, yeah.
Yeah. Why did we go to the trouble of creating a full-time traffic engineer? Target zero. So the city council made that the #1 goal. The city council has, since 2014, the city council has said, we want 0 pedestrian and bicycle fatalities and serious accidents by the year 2025. And so one of the pieces of that was hiring a traffic engineer. And before that, we used King County traffic engineers on a as-needed basis, but now we have a full-time traffic engineer. He has a backlog of requests and complaints from citizens about speeding and parking and all sorts of things. He's implemented a lot of safety projects since he's been here too. So, all right.
I know that might look confusing because it says there's 0 positions, but this is because functionally he is accountable and reports to the engineering division, but his salary, benefits, and all his costs are accounted for in a different fund, in the street fund.
Okay, yeah, he is in the street fund, yep. And so the other engineers that you see there are to help us run our capital projects. Like we have a senior engineer who's running the walkways and waterways projects and some surface water projects and things like that.
And the bridge project, don't forget about the bridge
Yeah.
project.
Yeah.
It's a big one.
All right, community development. So community development has 2 main jobs. One is long-range planning, land use planning, zoning codes, anything to do with land use planning. And then they also run our parks capital projects. So they do those 2 things. So Mike Vanderline is on our planning commission, and so he knows a couple of people in this department really well, Debbie Bent and Lori Anderson.
Good people all.
Yeah, and so it takes a lot to staff and run a commission, but every year the city council gives the planning commission we want these amendments to our comprehensive plan, zoning code regulations, we want affordable housing regulations, and so those all go to the planning commission, and throughout the year the planning commission works on those issues and then provides recommendations to the city council. The planning commission meets twice a month, and on Tuesdays, right? On alternating Tuesdays. So that's why we're doing it on 2nd and 4th Tuesdays. Yeah. So, and then like I said, that department also builds our new parks projects, including the walkways and waterways projects. Development services is a short term for that. It's called permitting. So anything to do with a land use permit or a building permit is over here in this department. They also do code enforcement. So if your neighbor has a junk car or weeds in their yard that are too tall, Development Services does code enforcement. And by the way, code enforcement, I forgot to put that on there. That's an optional service. We don't have to do code enforcement. We can let people have junk cars in their yards if we wanted to. So, all right, is that it?
Before you move on to that, if you scroll back up to the line up there that has the total expense, we have a total budget expense of about $2.4 million and revenue of 1.8. Going back to your point that this is an optional service, is it realistic to think that that departmental revenue line should match the expense? So I assume that most of that revenue has to do with fees of some sort?
Right. That typically is something that you try to balance out.
Yeah.
The building permits, the plan review, the inspections should pay for a large chunk of that department.
Yeah, and I understand that there's variability in that depending on how much a development goes on
Exactly.
year to year. But if we could close that deficit, that looks like an opportunity.
Yeah.
Does the city set the rates for permitting and?
Yes.
and When was the last time that was adjusted or increased?
We did a study on that like 2 years ago, maybe?
2 years ago, 2017.
Yeah, we hired a firm called FCS to come in. And we can only charge what our costs are. We can't make a profit on this. So if we have a building inspector go out and inspect a newly poured foundation, we can only, the permit for that can only be what our actual cost is for the inspector to go out and inspect it. So when it comes to building permits, we try to get as close to 100% cost recovery as we can. On the land use side, land use permits, like where you come and apply for a short plat or something like that, we're less close to 100% cost recovery, because one theory is that on the land use permits, the work that the city is doing is not just benefiting the applicant, but it's benefiting the whole community. And so therefore the general fund should help chip in on that. That's a philosophical decision, but yeah. But on the building permits, we try to get close to 100%. On land use, we're probably closer to 60% or something like that. So, and then we have a code enforcement officer in there that doesn't have any cost recovery at all. That's totally general fund supported. So, I failed to mention we have Tila Whiteman here helping us as our clerk for the meeting tonight. Tila is our permit specialist. So she's typically she is the main point person for taking in all permits for the city. And this is just her moonlighting job tonight. Tila, do you have anything to add for your department for development services?
I think you guys covered it.
Okay.
I think code enforcement has like a 1% cost recovery.
Like
Probably less than
Would
that.
be fines.
in fines and
Yeah.
things like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of doozies going on right now. If I had more time, I'd tell you about some code enforcement cases we have going on right now. They're crazy. So, all right. All right.
I guess on that point, though, for the cost recovery of code enforcement, is that because there aren't that many there aren't that many codes that are being violated, and therefore nothing to collect, or because you don't get money from them, or?
Oh, great question. Yeah, so for the most part, except for when it's safety or hurting the environment, we only respond to code enforcement by complaint. We don't go out looking for stuff unless it's safety or the environment. And so, like, if somebody has a junk car, we're typically not going to go after that property owner unless the neighbors are complaining. And we always start out nice. So we usually stop by and just gently say, you may be in violation of our code. Here's my business card. And if they don't respond or do anything, then we'll follow up with a nice letter. And if the nice letter doesn't work, then we'll do a corrective action letter. And none of those things generate any money for the city. So most of our cases are resolved voluntarily before we get into the fine territory. But there's a very small number of cases where we actually have to start issuing fines. And even when we issue fines, we don't get fine money, because oftentimes they'll appeal it to a hearing examiner, and the hearing examiner will say, okay, well, if you fix the problem, the city will waive the fee. And so we don't collect very much money, because it's either voluntarily resolved or they comply in exchange for having their fee waived, their fine waived. So,
Which is probably a philosophy we'd want to stick with anyway.
I think so. I mean, we could, for every junk car we see or whatever, we could go straight to fining people. But then we would be very hated.
Yeah. Makes sense.
But most people comply voluntarily after the first one or two contacts we make. Yeah, great questions. So, okay.
Maintenance?
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, this is a big one, yeah. So this is parks and streets and surface water maintenance. So think of our maintenance workers out in the field doing work. They have 3 main jobs. Well, 4 main jobs. So they maintain our city parks, they maintain our city roads, you know, potholes and signs and things like that. They manage our surface water systems, like fix pipes and catch basins and grates and things like that. And then they also maintain our city facilities, like City Hall and the hangar and the senior center at Rhododendron Park. So they do all those things. One thing worth noting is up until 2019, we were contracting with Lake Forest Park for maintenance services. Long story short, we discontinued that relationship. Actually, they are the ones that blinked and wrote us a letter and said, we're not going to provide services for you. So in May of 2018, they wrote us a letter saying, we're done with you by the end of this year. So we had to scramble and come up with our own maintenance crew by January 1st of 2019. And we had to have equipment and people in places, snow plows, because 1 month after we took over, we had Snowmageddon. So, yeah, that was interesting. We're also at a temporary site for a public works shop. That's not a long-term solution. It's the site right in front of the library. It's way too small, and we're also, where they do their turnouts and things is on the back side of the post office building, which the city owns. But we're in search of a permanent public works shop site. We've got a couple properties in mind that we're talking about. So, but so what's interesting is we think we're saving about $250,000 to $300,000 a year by bringing this in-house from Lake Forest Park, just on an operational basis. So day-to-day operations, we think we're saving $200,000 or $300,000 a year. That's good, right? Well, except for one thing. We had to pay for startup costs, and we have to pay for a site acquisition. And so that actually, for a few years, is going to make things more expensive than had we stayed with Lake Forest Park. But in the long haul, we believe that it'll be a cost savings to the city. So, and we are so glad that we took it on in-house. Nothing against Lake Forest Park, but it was just 2 cities competing fiercely for the same resources, and we both had just more expectations and demands on the same staff. Now that we have our own local control and we can deploy our maintenance workers as we see fit without having to negotiate with Lake Forest Park, we have much better service and much better responses to the city's needs. So I'm really glad we actually took that in-house.
So that department concluded the cost centers in the general fund, and our exercise or our financial sustainability study is to look at operations. So we also include the street fund, which is a separate fund, but it's an operational fund. And we include it in this analysis too because it can't be self-supporting because the only dedicated revenue source it receives is gas tax and some revenues from the state. So when it is in need of funds, it has to come from the general fund. So we have rolled them together for this process to look at both of those as operations. So the street fund is one more component of that.
Yeah, and when the city council created this task force and this process, one thing was made super clear. This whole process and this whole task force is about only 2 city funds, the general fund and the street fund. And I call them the 2 general fund funds because the general fund feeds the street fund. But that's what this whole exercise is about, is the general fund and the street fund, our operating funds. Surface water utility fund is doing fine. City Council recently did a rate adjustment there to make sure we were covering our costs in surface water. And then our capital funds for building stuff, those are totally separate pots of money that receive one-time revenues like grants and things like that. And those are separate from the general fund. That said, capital projects do eventually impact the general fund. How so?
Operations.
That's right. Once the project is built, then the general fund and the street fund have to take on the maintenance of those new facilities.
Rob, do you
Yeah.
have the facility sinking fund to help with the upkeep of those facilities?
We do. Joanne, do you want to speak to that?
We have a fund called the Equipment Replacement Fund, and it's like a sinking fund. And the general fund, the street fund, the surface water fund contribute to it to replace a number of the assets, mostly equipment and vehicles. We have not yet used it to put aside money for infrastructure, facilities, and that was one of the recommendations from management partners, is that we need to beef up our contribution to that fund for future replacement. Yes.
Yes, so you remember when Steve Toller presented at your first meeting, he said that one of the things we need to do a better job is allocating more money to the equipment replacement fund for things like a new roof on City Hall and things like
Right.
that. So he built that into his forecast. So,
Because it will have to be paid from here.
yeah, yeah. So those lines that are crossing in his forecast includes more money for things like replacing the roof on City Hall. One thing we don't save for is really big things like replacing a bridge. So, and maybe we should, that's something we should think about, but like back in 2014, we had a study done on the bridge and they said, yeah, you need to replace the bridge. Guess how much money we had saved up for that bridge? Zero. Now, that sounds irresponsible, and maybe it is, but we also knew that we were going to get a lot of grant money for that. So most of that bridge is being paid for from state and federal grants. So that's one dynamic of being a local government, is some things grants pay for, so you don't have to save up for them. There's no grant money for a new roof on City Hall, though.
Do you have any bargaining units in the city?
Nope.
None.
Yep. And we're small. We only have about 40 employees. To contrast that, Mount Lake Terrace, just really close to here, is about the same population as Kenmore. They have over 200 employees. We have 40. Mount Lake Terrace has 200, same population. Is that because they're bloated and inefficient? No, it's because they provide services differently. They have a fire department. I don't know if they have a fire department. They have a police department.
Mount Lake
court.
Terrace?
Yeah.
No.
What?
No fire.
No fire, thank you. But they have police, court, utilities, things they provide in-house. So that's kind of a reason why they have more employees than we do. So.
I put this little spreadsheet up here to sort of support Rob's description of the fund accounting that we have to do and how there are different types of funds and never, you can't intermingle them. So what we're focusing on in this study is the general fund and the street fund, and these other two funds are like our savings accounts or our reserve funds. So we can look at those as part of this picture too. But then there are what are called special revenue funds, where the money goes in and has to be used for a specific purpose, not operations. So that would include these two funds, the Public Art Fund and the Transportation Benefit District Fund. And then we have another fund where we have to put all the revenues that come in from property taxes to repay the bonds on the walkways and waterways projects, and that has to be tracked separately. Then there are a number of capital funds, and Rob talked a little bit about this. There are real estate excise taxes and impact fees and bond funds that are totally restricted to capital projects. So there's the resources on one hand, and then the project funds on the other hand, where you account for the expenses. And of course, this generates a lot of transfers back and forth from the revenue type funds to the expense type funds. And then surface water is an enterprise fund, which means it's self-supporting based on fees that are assessed to cover the cost of their operations. So it cannot contribute to the general fund except to pay back for services that the general fund might provide, like administration. And then here is our little equipment replacement fund, which is called an internal service fund. So it's just a sinking fund where we've set aside money for future replacement of vehicles and some equipment. So that's just kind of an overview of the types of funds that we might refer to throughout this process, but we're focusing on the general fund and the street fund.
Yeah, and you mentioned you see the Strategic Reserve Fund and Strategic Opportunities Fund. They sound like mutual funds, don't you think? Strategic Opportunities. So they both have the word strategic in there, but they're different. So the Strategic Reserve Fund is really for rainy days. And what's the fund balance in that fund?
1.4 approximately.
Million, yeah. So we have 1.4 million just sitting in a rainy day fund for disasters and really bad things. And in addition, we have a Strategic Opportunities Fund. And here's the story on that fund. So we used to have a $5 million fund balance in the general fund. It used to be, so it was a $10 million a year fund. That's how much revenue you got. And we had a savings account balance of $5 million in the general fund. And that's a pretty high percentage. When you're at 50%, that's kind of high. Most cities like to be around 10 or 20%. So what the city council did is they said, okay, we got $5 million in the savings account. Let's take 2.5 of that and put it in a different fund and call it Strategic Opportunities. And it's still unrestricted like the general fund. We can do whatever we want with it, but they just decided to set it aside in a special, what I call piggy bank or savings account, but it's for strategic opportunities. Not necessarily for rainy days, but it's for things like, wow, there's a piece of potential parkland that we want to buy, and it's on the market, and it's perfect. It meets our plan for parks, and it's an opportunity that's about to go. Let's buy it, or something like that. We haven't done that, but but we have used it to supplement. Oh yeah, actually we have.
Yeah, we have.
We bought the Squires property, but
well, in the lot where our public works equipment is.
Yeah, that was before Strategic Opportunities, but wasn't it? Okay, you're right. Oh yeah, my memory's bad, but yeah, we have. You're right. We have used it to buy land on occasion, and then also to supplement some capital projects. We've used it for. One thing that's happened though is we've actually replenished that fund. So we'll maybe, I'll just make this up, we'll carve out $500,000 to supplement a capital project. And then we usually replenish that fund with better than anticipated budgeting at the end of the year. So our revenues will come in higher, our expenditures are lower, and we take that and use that to replenish the general fund. The Strategic Opportunities Fund. So the Strategic Opportunities Fund balance has hovered around $2.5 million since we created that fund back in 2013. So, but if you count the Strategic Opportunities Fund balance and the general fund balance, we actually have a healthy fund balance.
We try to target about $2.5 million in our general fund, in our operating fund. And we've got about $2.5 million in the Strategic Opportunities Fund.
Yeah.
So anything over about $2.5 million in the general fund, we will move to that savings.
Yep. And our general fund balance recently grew to as high as $4 million not counting strategic opportunities. So I guess that's one of the pieces of good news I want you all to know is that we have been adopting balanced budgets. We have not been operating in a deficit. And because we've been having balance, we've been actually able to grow our reserves. But we're looking ahead and we're seeing that that's not going to sustain for, in the long term. So that's why we're all gathered here and working on this.
Yeah, I would say even during the recession, we didn't have to dip into our reserves to maintain our operations. We weren't able to save any more, but we didn't deplete our reserves. I know some cities had to dip into those to continue to operate at the level they were, and
we didn't do
not
any
have to do
layoffs
that.
either, did we? No. Yeah. So,
Joanne, do you currently utilize REIT for any asset maintenance?
I'm sorry.
Do you use any REIT dollars for asset maintenance, or are you using it just for capital?
Historically, we've always used it for capital. Now and right now we still need pretty much every dollar for capital because we have some huge capital projects going on. But we've talked about shifting maybe you can some of that to maintenance because you can use up to, I think, $100,000 a year of it for maintenance. But we haven't done that yet.
and that might be a piece of a strategy.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Right now with the bridge and the walkways and waterways projects and all of them kind of exceeding our budget estimations, we're gathering all the dollars that we can for the capital.
When we add new capital projects, how do you reflect, or how do we reflect the ongoing operating cost or maintenance cost for those? Like if we add a park, we know we're going to have an increased maintenance cost to maintain the level of service of that park. How do we reflect that in our budgets or our projections?
So Jennifer Gordon, our maintenance and operations manager, we get together and we say, okay, what are we paying for maintenance of existing parks? What are our landscape contracts and things like that? And then based on that, the proportion, we then impose that on future park maintenance. So like the walkways and waterways projects that are going to be coming online in 2023, those additional maintenance costs are in the forecast.
Thank you. That's what I was really asking. Do we have that already built into the budget?
Not
So it's not going to be a big surprise to us a couple of years down the line.
Yeah. So, these are really awesome questions. But yeah, this whole exercise is about the operating budget, and in particular the general fund and the street funds. So this is not about how do we build more parks or roads. This is just about how to make the books balance on our operations. Okay, what's next on the agenda?
Well, I was going to run through, now that we've spent quite a bit of time on the operating expenses, to give a rundown on the revenue side. I see it's almost 10 after 8, so I can walk you through this pretty quickly. This whole document that I'm illustrating here really is taken right out of the budget book. So it is something that you could refer to at a later date, but in there is a section called All Funds Revenue Analysis, and I've just excerpted from that the general fund and the street fund revenue sources. So if we walk through here, you can see makeup of the proportions of the main revenue sources for the general fund. And I think Steve Toller went over the main sources of general fund revenues pretty thoroughly when he did his presentation on the 22nd. So I don't know that I really need to go into a lot of detail about this unless you would like me to, if there's any particular area you'd like to know more about it. So it talks first about the property tax levy. You can see how the levy's changed over the years and the levy rates, and it goes into a little analysis of the tax bill, and then gives some history on sales taxes and utility taxes and a number of other major revenue sources for the general fund. So is there anything in particular in here you'd really like to see, or would you like to kind of explore it on your own
Where
in
is
the
this,
budget?
you say?
Pardon?
This is in the budget?
It's in the budget.
Do you happen to know what page?
It's in the executive section, executive summary section, but I can't tell you what page.
Okay.
Called revenue analysis. I tried to pull the actual budget up on my computer here, and I couldn't. And there was another graphic I wanted to show you as well, the fund types. Oh, this might be it. So this was an overview I wanted to share with you that shows within the general and street fund revenue sources, kind of how they stack up against each other. Here's the little chart that supports this graph, but you can see property taxes, of course, is our major revenue source for the general fund, followed by sales taxes, other taxes, licenses and permits, et cetera. And then this is the street fund, which is mainly gas tax. That's gas tax and then whatever the general fund puts in there, and then the transportation benefit district fees. And you may remember that the transportation benefit district initiative failed, or it may go away, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I-976, right. We'll take it away. So that is a source of revenue for our street maintenance operations of about $350,000 a year.
We talked about last time that there was a court decision to be made on that, and that happened?
So I understand we're going to continue to collect those fees until there's a court decision.
Okay.
So that's helpful. It'll get us through this biennium mostly. And then on the departmental side again, and we talked about the departments in detail, these are those cost centers compared to each other, so you can see where our big cost drivers are in public safety. And then city manager, because city manager covers many programs and functions and activities. And here's a little historical chart for that. And again, here's a pie chart that shows you how the different department expenditures make up the sum in relationship to each other, with public safety, of course, being 31% of the budget. The next biggest one, transportation. And looking at it a different way, one of the ways we categorize our expenditures too is to look at them by function. So is it going towards culture and recreation? Are the expenses for the economic environment? Are they general government? Here's a different look at that that might be useful to you. And then again, by object. So personnel costs are 33% of the budget. Services 27%, because we do contract for many, many services. And then our intergovernmental, which would include the police contract and the jail. So those are just some different ways to present the expenditures. You can look at them in different facets. One of the things we really wanted to share with you too tonight is what we have done over the years to, in our efforts to sustain the budget. I can pull that up. Yeah, here we go. Yeah. Right, I did give you a copy of this at your place. Oh, okay. This one?
No, I don't think you guys.
They don't think these guys.
Yeah,
But we will send it to you.
yeah, we got it.
I don't think so.
Got it now.
If you've got, we'll be happy to give it to you if you don't have it.
You do have a
But I did print out not only this sheet, but Rob wanted to also brief you about things that we have added to the budget over years. It's not like we've always had cost-saving measures, but we have reacted
Do you mind if
many times over the years. But yeah, I'd like you to.
Okay, try to do this as fast as we can. I know that the handout we did is pretty small font, but, so we're, on this spreadsheet, we're following the 4 categories that Steve Toller recommends using. Number 1, control expenditures. Number 2, change service delivery. Number 3, enhance revenues. And number 4, reduce service levels. So using those same categories that Steve Toller is going to use when he makes his recommendations, these show you all the things we've tried to do over the years. We actually copied Kirkland. Kirkland did the same document, a similar document, and so they gave us the idea.
Yeah.
Anyway, some of the things we've done is like started charging.
Mm-hmm. Oh, look.
Oh, there it is. Ah, thank you. We used to pay for asphalt overlays out of general fund, but when you do overlays, it's so we started charging asphalt overlays to the state excise tax fund, which took pressure off the general fund. Another thing that we did is the contract and the union contract with the Sheriff's Guild says that once the contract city hits 20,000 people, then the rank of the chief goes from sergeant to captain. And not only that, it's not just a change in rank, but you also have to create a new sergeant position because captains have to supervise sergeants according to the We've been able to get the county to just let us continue having a sergeant. So that's probably saved 150 grand a year.
Yeah, probably more.
Just by convincing the county to let us keep our chief of police as a sergeant. And just this year, last year, we decided to have the 1% for art fund. Do you guys know where what the funding source is for 1% for arts? Capital projects. Capital projects contribute 1% of the whole project. Separate fund that we track. We decided to have some of that money help pay for the summer project. Not very much money, but these are all little things that add up. We also restructured our medical benefits with our employees. There is a net savings to the city. Also, our employees participate in a wellness program that allows. And contracting for services in general, like instead of having our own GIS employee, IT, Joanne was in charge of IT. We have a firm that comes on a part-time basis. They come on Fridays. So if you have an IT problem, you have to wait.
They have a help desk now. It's not quite that strict.
But we do have somebody that comes around on Fridays,
Yeah.
but it's a firm that we use, and we save money rather than having our own IT manager. And then this was right when I was getting here. The right-of-way permitting was done by the county, and they were charging us an arm and a leg, and we actually saved money by bringing that. Sometimes bringing something in-house makes sense financially, and sometimes it doesn't. Like for IT, for example, financially it would be more expensive to bring it in-house, but in the case of permitting inspections for right-of-way, it makes sense to bring it in. We also brought some landscape maintenance in-house from council direction is to transition. We collect fees from the incubator clients, so that'll be a net savings of about. Then for one-time project needs, we just have temp employees help us rather than hiring full-time employees. On the revenues, we did implement a new franchise fee back in 2013, also the $20 car tab fee back in 2013. Those two combined bring in about $1 million more in revenue. Then, did we tell you about bank capacity on property tax? We ended up taking 3% in 2019.
We haven't banked it, I think, for about.
Taking the 1%. You want to talk, oh, this is charging overhead to surface water. Yeah, that's something we started doing. We annually increase our development service fees by CPI or via a rate study.
That was the rate study you mentioned that we did a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And then since then, it's been CPI.
And we charge overhead to capital projects, which takes pressure off the general fund. We did a B&O tax on heavy manufacturing back in 2016. That only brings in 20 grand a year, something like that. We increased parking fines from 20 to 50. One thing I need to tell you about court is that King County Court collects and keeps all the fines and fees. And then they also track the costs associated with Kenmore, and then we write them a check for the difference. And so it does help to collect more parking fees, but county keeps them all, and it just reduces the net check we send to them every year. And what do we pay in a subsidy to the district court every year? Do you remember? Is it like 100 grand?
80 to 120,000
Yeah.
a year.
We subsidize the court by about 100 grand a year. There's a myth out there that people think that municipal courts are self-sustaining and money cash registers, but I've never worked for a city where that's true. Maybe in Briar.
The fees that we pay, because we contract out for the court, is that on a usage basis? Or is
Yeah,
it?
so they track how much, they have, they track their costs by case, and then they say, okay, Kenmore had so many cases that we processed in 2019.
And it depends on the type of case, DUI versus a parking fine, and they all have different weights for how much staff and time is needed to process it and
So,
run it through the court system.
so just thinking through, if your per case is a net loss, because your fees don't make up for the amount, and you increase the parking fees, more people might go to court, incur more costs. So it could be a wash depending on activity and things like that, as far as
Yeah.
fines and stuff
Yeah,
like that goes.
that's true. And another thing is, you could say, well, just have the cops go out and write more tickets. Well, for one thing, the state collects about half of the parking ticket, and we only keep half. The court only keeps half. And the other thing is, for every so many traffic stops, one results in a criminal stop, which blows your budget out of the water, because now you got to book and process them through the court system and everything. So I don't know what the stat is here, but in one of the cities I worked for, the chief of police said for every 8 traffic stops, 1 is a criminal stop, which wipes out any traffic ticket money you collected from the other 7. I don't know what that stat is here, but that was in one of my cities.
Yeah, I think one thing that's jumping out to me that's like good from a citizen's perspective is that like any punitive action the city takes, criminal, junk cars in the lawn, is a net negative to our budget. right? Like pretty overwhelmingly. And so, same point I raised earlier, for us thinking about how to make things more sustainable, right? Like those aren't really controllables for the most part, something to think about, but certainly eye-opening. The things that are jumping out to me from this, if we can go to, enhancing revenues, like it looks like in the list that Rob shared all the things we've added, right? Like volunteer and events coordinator in 2015, new North Church Summit Park, new park, new skate court, halftime recreation coordinator. Those line up with like the first two bullet points on the Kenmore 20-year vision, right? We're like very focused on those investments, but we've only done one thing, kayak concession at Lagoon Park, 10% of revenues, that even attempt to make any of those things sustainable or make money, right? You mentioned like the summer programs that other people come in and we like coordinate with them to make money off of our resources that we've invested in. And so I'm sure people have looked at this and thought about it, but I would love to know like what's been talked about as a way to bring those services in-house. And the same thing with that we've learned from maintenance, right? Like how do we take our investments in parks? How do we take like improving the image of Kenmore and turn those into positives for our budget, right? Like we're running our own league. Is that financially sustainable for Kirkland? Like probably not. But I think it would be interesting to see like try and line up this with the things that we're already like committed to as a city that like pass, right? Because what we don't want to do is come up with a budget that says like, stop arresting people, right? Like it's killing our budget, right? It's hard to pass at a city council, right? So in like the effort of like, Rob said, counting to 4, like trying to line up with the things that the city wants to do. I think it'd be interesting to look at doing more things in bucket 3 here that people would be like amenable to, right? Like what are the things we can invest in that we can either turn like a half-time employee to a full-time employee and gain 2 to 3 times that income based on something, like running some sort of program that people would be willing to pay for and participate in.
Great comments. Love it. Yeah.
Well, I think that concludes the financial information we were trying to impart, because I wanted to spend a little time on the engagement plan. Is that correct, Jim?
Well, we have 3 minutes.
3 minutes?
I don't know if you've looked at it, but we could just do highlights. So if you want to bring it to your attention and have you comment on it, but I don't think we have to keep you voted. And I just want to ask, does anybody else have any questions or observations they want to raise?
Yeah, that was awesome.
Think about it, because our next meeting is in 2 weeks, not 3. And at that meeting, by the way, we are going to have more time for you to ask questions that are on your mind from the first 2 weeks.
Are all the town halls here at City Hall or the hangar 1 or 2?
No, since you're, local Saturday, yeah. So,
Yeah.
Richard, I think we just have to go through this with my 1 minute. So, and I'm talking as not as your facilitator, but part of my contract is to help with the communications piece. And I do really want to compliment Joanne and Rob for thinking about a couple different events, and their timing is really geared toward important decisions or tentative decisions that you might be making, or important presentations that Steve might be making to you, and then going public with them. And one other thing I like about it is, everybody has different learning styles or different comfort levels. So for example, the first public engagement event is probably going to be a little bit more traditional. Maybe you'll have a bigger audience and people would be asked to comment publicly. And for some people, that's kind of intimidating. So the second one is thought to be 2 sessions of like an hour each, which are coffee sessions, kind of like what they do with the Coffee with the Council. So it would be Coffee with Rob and Joanne at 7 a.m. one morning, April 9th, and then at 5 p.m. that day, just to accommodate different people's schedules and comfort levels. And then we haven't really quite figured out what the third one would be, except for that by then you will be coming towards some recommendations, and Steve will as well. He wants to come back 1 week before he goes public. So that's why we asked you over the last couple of weeks if we could add an April 14th meeting. But then on April 20th, there would be a public session, or maybe, I'm sorry, I kind of got away from my script, it might be, I'm sorry, it's April 28th. So it would be like a little bit before your last meeting, he would come and present his work, as well as maybe we'd even present some of yours to the public on April 28th. So they are different for different purposes at different times and different formats too. So, unless you have any questions about it, but one thing I think that we have, that Joanne and Tori, before she left, and Rob and I had talked about, was a role for all of you, and we haven't decided that, or we're not dictating it, but I think you would be heavily encouraged, and we could even look at, is there some role that you might want to be taking to be speaking to your fellow citizens as representatives of the community too? So we could still work on that a bit too. Yeah. Yeah. So that's why I hope you can put them on your calendar, and then we could even talk a bit later about what role you might play.
Communications person does a really great job, I think, keeping the community informed. I mean, I get the newsletters and the emails and all those things, and you don't have to go searching for information from Kenmore. I think you do a really good job. I appreciate having on here the electronic survey option and materials and whatnot. It's really awesome.
We actually have a new communications person starting next week, and one of her first assignments or roles will be to become involved in this with this group too, so she can continue that effort and make sure that what we're doing is available and out there, so other people can participate and understand what's going on.
Do we have a large population that doesn't speak English as their primary language?
Yes.
Yeah. Do we have the ability to do some of these materials in other languages, or have some sort of outreach to different populations?
We have done that. Particularly planning has taken that on, so I'm sure there are resources we could use. I'm not as familiar with them, but
That's a good
it's
thought.
a good
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it for this process, but yeah, we need to. That if we do that for a lot of our land use, this is just as important.
Thank you, Lynn. Any other comments or questions or observations about this, Mike?
Yeah, question. When we get to the point of you had asked a question about our involvement in the public meetings and whatnot. I guess my thought on that would, role or the level of participation would depend upon what the city's looking for from this group. Are you looking for an endorsement of the recommendations that would come out of the Toller consultation? Or are you looking for us to give input that would allow them to do that? Those are two different roles. And if we were being asked or expected to actually issue an endorsement, that would involve a higher level of, or need for a higher level of involvement and participation.
No, we're not expecting you guys to give an endorsement of the Toller recommendations. You may come up with totally separate recommendations than what Steve Toller provides. But yeah, I think just being at the meetings and hearing from the public will hopefully help you make a better decision. We're not saying that you have to be at the meetings. We can provide summaries and high-level input and things like that, but
Being pretty fresh to these kinds of government engagement things, like what kind of role would we take in a public meeting other than to be there and listen? But and obviously I'm trying to learn as much as I can, but is there a role of, I don't know, answering questions or something that like would fit? Because I feel like my expertise is going to be very low comparatively to you and Joanne and things like that. So like what would a role even look like for the task force members?
Well, I'll give you my opinion just based on the fact I've done so many of these things before. I think just as a symbol of you being there, maybe getting introduced and listening and learning would be very powerful. I can't imagine that you would be put on the spot having to answer questions other than perhaps maybe one of you volunteers and speaks for 2 minutes on behalf of the whole task force just to talk a little bit about your process or something like that.
Okay.
So I don't think you'd be put in an awkward spot where expected to like know too much in a way. And as Mike just asked too, if you're not going to be asked to endorse anything or to be kind of put in that position either where you have to like drum up public support either, so.
We're thinking you could be like a talk show host, like Phil Donahue, you know? Around the island.
That's what they taught me in accounting school, is how to do that.
Well, maybe at one of the future meetings, you could give us a little a better understanding of just exactly what, how our input would be reflected in whatever the final report that goes out or presentation at the public meetings.
Yeah, we will gladly do that. I think right now we're just kind of introducing this to you, especially the dates. And I do think it's based on how do things play out with Steve's report and your meetings. So we would probably come at some point with a much clearer agenda. For example, the very first one, which by the way, the date isn't set, but it's the week of March 16th. And according to Steve's calendar, the 17th is the best, but we haven't quite determined that yet. So, but I like your point, Mike. I appreciate it a lot. So. Anything else? Otherwise, we'll let you go.
Can I just hand out two quick documents? These are internal documents that I use with my coworkers. This is our service vision that our employees came up with, and this is also a document about kind of what business are we in. These are kind of inspirational type documents that help us keep our focus.
And if there's anything that you can think of that you would like to see in the interim before our next meeting, any more in-depth analysis of a particular program or function or expenditure or revenue, let us know and I'll get that ready and provide it. See, we gave you copies of this, but if you'd like us to email you any other documents that we showed over the course of the evening, I'd be happy to do that too. I didn't provide copies of things that were in the budget, but I'd be happy to.
And Joanne, one thing I'd like to see is any projections that you've done on what the increase in real estate tax revenue would be by changing the zoning for certain properties to their highest and best use, such as some of the mobile home parks. What increase in revenue would that generate by changing the zoning and/or approving the sale of those properties, overturning some of the decisions city councils made before that could significantly increase revenue? So I don't know if you've done any projections on what that would be, or whether that would be a little presumptuous on your part to overturn what the city council's already decided.
I haven't done any work in that area, but I can certainly get with Debbie and talk about this too, our community development director.
Maybe along those same lines, in the graphs we saw before where we see the crossing of the lines between the revenue and the expenses here, in that revenue projection, have we taken into account the work that's already been done to increase the amount of housing stock and in the city, and what impact that might have if we were to achieve those goals, which are based upon what we're being required to do in terms of presenting a plan by the county and the state, actually, I guess it is the state. If we were to achieve 100% of that, what would be the impact on property taxes? You have to make some assumptions about what type of development would go in there. But if we achieved 80% of it, what would that look like? If that's incorporated in those numbers already, then maybe you can just share that with us. But if it isn't, it'd be interesting because I think there's a good point there. We have an opportunity to be able to impact long-term property tax revenue through our zoning code, and we ought to be able to understand just what the level of sensitivity that is to that.
Okay. I don't think that that's specifically built into that model at this time. We have some really big, broad assumptions for growth and assessed value, but not specifically tied to our projections for housing
And that's
stock and
consistent
meeting
with my reading. It looks like
yeah.
we have a kind of a straight line
Yeah.
assumption of a percentage growth over time, but that's not actually related to the additional housing stock
You're correct.
that we're planning for. And we've created zoning and also some incentives to have that happen. So if we got halfway to that, it's probably a bigger number than what's built into the assumption right now, which is, it's nice to have it conservative, But if we're putting a lot of time and effort into additional density and infill, that's going to yield something in terms of property tax. We'll probably have a offsetting increase in service expense too. But that's got to move that curve, or at least push it out further.
Good point.
And when we were going through the expenses, it seemed like all the big items, we did a study 2 years ago, we did a study 3 years ago, where, it would be $1 million more if we pulled this in-house, or, those kinds of things. If we could get a list of all the kind of categories of spending and the most recent study or assessment that you've done, and kind of where we're at on those things, just, I don't know if how easy or accessible this kind of information is, but
Are
I
there
feel like
things
you guys do a lot of this work already, and I'd love to kind of see where we stack up against what the work you've already done.
Okay, so a list of what we've done, would you like to actually see the report?
I don't need to see the report necessarily, but just, when I'm looking at a police safety line and say, "Ooh, that's a big number. Should we go after that number?" It's like, no, we did a study 2 years ago. I'm going to forget what Rob said, throughout the meeting. But if there was kind of a list of those big contracts or the big hitters and saying, here's this $2 million a year that we spend. We did a study. We're actually doing well, and just kind of have that high level summary. I don't know what that looks like specifically. It seems like you guys have done a lot of work, and definitely want to give you credit and not spin our wheels on things that there seems to be already be an answer for. Does that make sense?
I think it does. Yeah.
I'll leave it open-ended. I don't know what I'm asking for, but just kind of.
Well, we can give you something, and if it's not what you asked for, then we'll keep looking at. But it did remind me, because you brought up police services and keeping the city safe, and how do we compare? So in March, is the police chief going to give his annual report at a city council meeting? And whether you listen or watch it or would like a copy of that report when it hits the agenda, that might be something of interest to you too, because it may contain that kind of information on levels of crime, different types of crime, and caseload and calls for service.
Yeah, great.
So the next.
No, good committee.
It's 2 weeks from tonight, that's February 25th, 6:30 to 8:30. We're going to be talking about fiscal capacity, different comparisons that you had even asked for in our first meeting, like in tax rates, the price of government, and then again, some of the things that you've been asking for, we're trying to weave into presentations, but I think there'll be a little bit more, let's say, smart or clear answers to some of the questions you're asking. By the way, I've been trying, I was just frantically searching through my notes, Jeff, to give you one example of something that was said tonight about a report, but that'll all be in the summary that I sent you too. So questions you've asked, as well as a reference to some of the different reports that we reference to. So, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate it.